Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our series on Ma'aseh Bereishit, the account or the workings of creation. I thought this would be the last class in the series, but I came up with a lot of new material, and so this will not be the last class. Perhaps next week will be the next class. So I'm going to start with a quick review because what we're going to learn tonight is a continuation of last week. Last week, we were learning from the Gemara in Chagiga about the concept of pillars on which the earth rests. And we found that it was actually quite allegorical, symbolic, this idea of what are the pillars on which the earth rests. There's a verse that says the earth exists on these pillars. And then there were different opinions. Well, how many pillars are there? I'm not going to go back over everything that we learned. Everyone can access previous classes either on Telegram, on our website, or on YouTube. But we explored this idea of pillars. And at one point, they were very, very allegorical that the earth rests on the water. And we learned that the water represents Torah. There's no water mentioned in the Torah that doesn't allude to the Torah. And the water rests on the mountains. So already we see that physically what mountains are above the waters. And what do the mountains rest on? What are their pillars? The air. And so we learned that the pillars were the sages of the Torah. The air was their divine inspiration. What is the air based on? What are the pillars of the air? The storm wind. This is prophecy, because the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh are given over in states of divine inspiration and prophecy. And what does prophecy exist on? What are its pillars? The arms of God. And then there is an opinion, there are 12 pillars representing the 12 tribes. And there are 7 pillars. This represents the very important number 7 that appears throughout Jewish tradition. And the last opinion was Tzaddik Yesod Olam. The Tzaddik, the righteous one, is the foundation of the world. Everything rests on the Tzaddik. And then, taking this, we explore the idea of, well, what are these pillars? What is it trying to teach us? So we translated the concept of pillars to principles. What are the principles on which life exists? The Torah exists. The earth exists. And then we went to a different Gemara in Makot, and we saw, and we did a survey of all of history, different attempts to distill the teachings of the Torah into, David HaMelech did it in 11 principles, then Isaiah did it in 6, he did it again in 3, Micha did it in 3, and the last one, though, is Tzadik be'emunato yechiyah. A tzaddik, a righteous person in his or her faith will live. So it's interesting in these two different Gemaras, they both get to the same thing, that the tzaddik is the foundation of the world, and a tzaddik lives through his faith. That's the ultimate principle of Torah, is our faith. So that is all a review, but it will be the springboard of what I want to try to impart tonight. So there is a midrash that says that when God wanted to create the world, he asked the souls of the Tzadikim. He asked the souls of the Tzadikim. So everyone asks, what does that mean? There's no world. There's no time. There's no space. There are no souls. Who was he asked? Who was he consulting with? And the answer was, these are the future tzaddikim that will be born through creation. And we also learned previously this idea that when we say Kiddush and Shabbat, in a sense, we're giving testimony in our faith that God created the world. And we asked the question, how can we give testimony if we weren't there? So it's an excellent question. So the answer is a very, very profound answer. And that is the concept given over in the Tanya, that the soul is an actual part of God above. Because it says in the Torah explicitly that God created human beings in the image of God. But this is even a more inner explanation, that the soul is an actual part of God. So when God asks advice or consults with the souls of the tzaddikim, it was like an inner dialogue with himself. But these souls were part of God, and they later manifest in the physical world. And so here we're just connecting that. Last week we learned this idea that the Tzadik is the foundation of the world, that a Tzadik lives in their faith. This is the principle of the Torah. And so here, that's like our starting point to really understand, what does it mean that the Tzadik is the foundation of the world? I mentioned before, but a great scientist whose name was Wheeler, he passed away, I believe, around 20 years ago. But he developed a concept. There's actually a name for it, which I forgot to look up. But the principle was a very, very mystical, even Kabbalistic concept, that he said that if consciousness would not have been part of the creation from the beginning, creation could not happen. In other words, this is where we see how past, present, and future are all happening simultaneously. But he even takes it almost pre-creation and saying, without really human consciousness, then the creation couldn't have happened in the first place. Even though human consciousness is a later development in the creation, even according to the biblical account, mankind is not created until the sixth day, called the crown of creation, the last of the creations. And yet, if consciousness wouldn't have been in, like we'll call it the program, the hard drive, then nothing could have been created even from the beginning. So here we see that human consciousness and the idea of the righteous one, the Tzaddik. And we have a verse that says, Va'amech kulam tzadikim. And your people are all tzaddikim, all righteous. Meaning that in potential, every person has the capability, the potential to be a type of person that the whole world rests upon. And that's where we have this concept that there are 36 hidden tzadikim in every generation on which the whole world exists because of them. So this is a very deep concept because it could be you or me. We don't know who the hidden tzadikim are. There's also a concept of 36 revealed tzadikim in every generation, both revealed and hidden. In the first day of creation, the first explicit creation is light. Vayomer Elokim yihi or, vayihi or. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. It's the third verse in the Torah, but it's the first explicit creation. And there's a midrash that says, well, first of all, the idea that Rashi brings and everyone asks, if the sun and the moon were not put in their place until the fourth day, what kind of light is this on the first day? So some people say the sun and the moon in potential were already created the first day. Everything that would ever be created was already in potential on the first day. This is exactly what the Big Bang proposes, that everything that would expand into what we call the known universe was all within this almost infinitely small speck, and we don't even know what to call it, matter, energy, that explodes, and it is still expanding. So everything was there. It's like a seed. The seed of a tree, the entire tree is in the seed. You have this little tiny, let's say, redwood tree, because it's the tallest tree in the world. So anyone who's been in the redwoods, you look up and you're like amazed at the size of the tree. But at one point, it was a seed. A human being is a seed and an egg. That's where we come from. So the same thing with the universe. But the Midrash says about this light, we're told it was a spiritual light. And that light was hidden away. It was really too awesome. And it's called the Ora Ganuz, the hidden light. And as we've learned, that light was not taken away, it was just hidden. Hidden in the Torah, hidden in Shabbat, hidden in the menorah in the temple, and hidden in the Chanukiah of Hanukkah. That's just some of the ideas that we can access this light. So one midrash says, what was this light? The acts of the tzadikim. In other words, a tzaddik is compared to light. And just like light inspires, it represents purity, love, infinite, spiritual. Everything that light represents is represented by the tzaddik. So with that in mind, and I'll just mention one other idea, is we're told that how long did this light shine before it was taken away? So we're told it shone for 36 hours. And then Adam and Chava also had access to this divine infinite light, also for 36 hours. And we're told that's the connection of why we talk about 36 hidden tzadikim, because a tzaddik is connected to light. And just like light is the first creation, remember our context here is Ma'aseh Bereishit, learning about the account of creation. But here we see that the idea of the tzaddik is there from the beginning. That's the main point here. The idea of human consciousness and of the Tzadik, who is the foundation of the world, Yesod Olam, is there from the very beginning. So if we look in our tradition, there's really only one person that we call a tzaddik. Now, of course, there's many tzaddikim, but there's one person who's termed, who's referred to, and that is Yosef HaTzadik. There's really no one else who has like that title. How did Yosef get this title? So first of all, we're told that the 7 ushpizim, the 7 ro'im, the shepherds that we invite into our sukkah, correspond to the 7 lower sfirot. And Yosef corresponds to Yesod, Tzadik, Yesod, Olam. But Yesod is always connected to being fruitful and multiply, to sexual energy. And the simple understanding, why is Yosef called Yosef HaTzadik, is because he was able to resist the almost unresistible temptation posed by the wife of Potiphar. There's one explanation that all of the evil inclination in the world coalesced around Yosef at that moment where he was being tempted. And he was able to flee. He ended up in jail for 12 years because of it, because he had the moral foundation to not to be with the wife of Potiphar. So that's a simple understanding. That's why he's called Yosef HaTzadik, because again, Tzadik is connected to the sexual energy, to Yesod. But Chassidut explains really a deeper understanding. And that is, he's called Yosef HaTzadik because if there was ever a person who had the right or the inclination or the ability to take revenge on his brothers when they came down to Egypt, they sold him to slavery. He was in jail for 12 years because of it, and separated from his beloved father, and separated from the land of Israel. So if there was ever a person, and he was the viceroy of Egypt, he could have had them all killed on the spot. But he didn't. And not only did he not, but he orchestrated a way for them all to do tshuva. He brought the family together, and he told them, you meant to do me evil, but God meant it for good. He was able to make this transition from what could have been total revenge into compassion. And so I want everyone to remember this concept of compassion, because it's going to run through the rest of what we're learning. Because again, this is the context of Ma'aseh Bereishit. And one of the things that we learned is that the only name of God that appears in the first 7 days of creation is the name Elohim. And this is 32 times. And Elohim is the name associated with Gevura, might, judgment, law. And of course, all of those things are positive. But the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei does not appear until the second telling. And so based on this, Rashi says, he brings the Midrash that says that in the beginning, God wanted to create the whole world only from the aspect of judgment, a measure for measure. The world would be perfectly balanced, and every action would have an equal and opposite reaction. Every measure would have an equal and opposite measure, and everything would work in like a perfect clockwork. But God, again, we're talking in human terms, came to the realization that the world couldn't exist like that, and especially human beings. You make one mistake and you're out. And so God introduced compassion into the formula for creation. And that's why in the second telling of the story, the first time that the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei appears, because that's the name of mercy and compassion, it now becomes part of the story, but we understand that it was there actually from the beginning, even though it's not mentioned in the account of creation of the 7 days, that we learn from this midrash that it actually was. And so here we see Yosef is the tzaddik because of his ability to have compassion, even when almost every human tendency would push him towards treating his brothers with harsh judgment. But he was able to overcome that, and that's why, according to Chassidut, he's called Yosef HaTzadik. Now, we see that in the story of Yosef, interestingly enough, he cries 7 different times. There's no one in the entire Tanakh that mentions that they cry so many times. And here again, you could see Yosef was a very strong individual. He was able to survive slavery, 12 years in jail, everything that he went through. And then he became viceroy of Egypt, and he ran Egypt. He actually saved the world. This is one simple understanding where it says, Tzadik Yesod Olam. The Tzadik is the foundation of the world. Well, Yosef literally saved the world from famine through his actions. He was the Yesod Olam in a very practical way. But nonetheless, he cries 7 different times, meaning he's a very sensitive person and he is full of compassion. And so we're not going to go over the 7 times that he cries, but we see that these are not mutually exclusive. Being sensitive, being emotional, having compassion, and being a strong, firm leader. We see that in Moshe also. Moshe was an incredibly strong leader, but he was full of compassion for the Jewish people constantly. So now I want to introduce another tzaddik who also cries. Now he's not referred to necessarily as a tzaddik, and here we're talking about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And so I want to introduce an idea here and explain a little bit why I'm trying to connect Yosef and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. They seem like very, very different people. There's approximately 1,500 years between them, but there's something that's similar, is they both cry, and they both are able to make a transition from what we'll call gevura to chesed, from possible judgment to compassion. And again, I said that the thread that's going to tie this whole thing together is the idea of the tzaddik and of compassion. Compassion as part of creation. Ma'aseh Bereishit. So when does Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai cry? But before I explain that, I want to explain a little bit about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So, in short, the famous story is that this is the time of the Romans. The Romans have already destroyed the temple, taken many people into exile and slavery, and they're ruling over Eretz Israel. And so Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was heard expressing great disdain for the Romans. So they put a price on his head. He is now persona non grata, and he actually was considered treasonous. So the famous story that he and his son hide in a cave for 12 years, very similar to Yosef at Tzadik. And we have to understand, and we'll see, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was a very, very judgmental person, as we're going to see right now. And so, after 12 years, and according to tradition, this is where the foundation of the Zohar was composed, was in this cave. So they hear a voice from heaven saying, who is going to tell Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai that the death penalty against him has been lifted? So Rabbi Shimon and his son go out, and the story is they see people farming the land, and they can't believe that every Jew isn't sitting and learning Torah. So it says everywhere that they put their eyes, they burned up everything. Now, it's not meant to be taken literally, but they were very judgmental. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was on such a high level, he couldn't understand the mundane world and people going around their mundane business. So a voice came from heaven and said, I didn't let you out of the cave for you to burn up my world. Go back to the cave. So they go back to the cave for another year. This time when they come out, it's Erev Shabbos, and they see a man with 2 bunches of myrtle branches, hadassim, that we use for Sukkot. And they ask him, why do you have 2 bunches of myrtle? This is just a regular person. And he says, well, one is for shamor, one is for zachor. These are the 2 words that appear in the 10 Commandments for the observance of Shabbat. Shamor is to guard the Shabbat, and zachor is to remember the Shabbat. So zachor is like all the positive things of Shabbat. Shamor are all the things that we are prohibited of doing. And Rabbi Shimon was so taken by this that he praised Israel. But what the story is trying to teach us is that Rabbi Shimon was a very fiery, very judgmental person. He knew his greatness, and anyone who didn't match his greatness, he had a hard time with. But he was able, just like Yosef was able to make this incredible transition, that he transitioned into a person with tremendous compassion. So Now we will go to when he cries. Again, this is after Rabbi Akiva, his teacher, had passed away. He is now the great mystic in Israel. And he gathered around himself a small group of students. And at a certain point, he gathers them together. And this is one of the most mystical parts of the Zohar. And it's called the Idra Rabba. It literally means the great threshing floor. But it means also a meeting place. The threshing floor is like, because it was an agricultural society, it's like a meeting place. And so Rabbi Shimon took 9 of his students and himself, and it says they went out into the fields by the forest. Now, they could have been in a cave, they could have been in the open, most likely in a cave, because this gathering, it doesn't tell us how long this gathering lasted, but it was a substantial amount of time. And right at the beginning, Rabbi Shimon cries, and he says, "Woe to me if I reveal, woe to me if I don't reveal." In other words, he had these secrets that he wanted to reveal, but he understood that these were very deep, profound, mystical ideas. And he himself was not sure if now was the time to reveal them. So he cried. And he said, "Woe to me if I reveal, woe to me if I don't reveal." And then he says, how long are we going to stand on one foot? And I'll explain that in a minute. And then he brings in a verse from Habakkuk about Yira. About Yira is the inner dimension of Gevura. Yira also means awe, also means fear. And not the fear of punishment, though it could mean that, but it really means reverence, having awe for God, for one's teacher, for life itself. And so he brings this verse about Gira, but then he tells his students, but for us, everything now depends on love, ahava. And this was a tremendous transition that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was going through himself, but he also understood that historically, that now was the time, if Jews were going to survive as a people, we have to understand that from the time Israel came into the land of Israel, approximately 1300 BCE, for 1300 years, this is actually close to, we're in the hundreds now, because Rabbi Akiva dies in approximately 120 CE. So he understands that the age of fighting it's not it can't be the answer. There were very few Jews left in Israel at that point. Most were already in exile in Babylonia from the first temple's destruction. Now the second temple is destroyed. And he understands that a tremendous transition has to happen. And for Jews to survive, it has to be based on love of God, love of Israel, the people, love of the land, and the love of Torah. That is what would assure Jewish survival. Fighting wouldn't do it anymore. And truthfully, until maybe 100 years ago, that is really what happened in Jewish history. The reestablishment of the state of Israel brought us back to having to fight for our rights to the land. So what did he mean by how long are we going to stand on one foot? So there's two possible answers. One is a Kabbalistic one, where we're told in the previous world of Tohu, one of the understandings is that the Sfirot, the 10 divine emanations, were structured one on top of the other. Some say that they were in 2 columns. Others say they were all in one line. So according to that, that is what Rabbi Shimon meant, because we all know that when we look at the Sfirot today, it's based on 3 columns, not 1 column. And so he was saying, how long are we going to, in a certain way, be in the world of chaos? It's time for the world of rectification. That's what the Arizal termed our world today. And it was based symbolically on the Sfirot being arranged in 3 columns. So you have 2 opposites, but always a middle pillar. This is what the Rambam called the golden mean. That 3rd inner pillar is what establishes this world as what's called world of rectification. But there's another explanation of what he meant. And that's the one I want to follow right now. And that is when he said, how long are we going to stand on one foot? What he meant was, I am the Tzadik of this generation. But it's time for that to be given over to more people. So I want to read from the Gemara what Rabbi Shimon said about himself at one point. And there are a number of these statements. I'm going to read 2 of them, or 3. So he says like this: the world possesses not less than 30 men as righteous as Abraham. We talked before about 36 hidden Tzadikim. There's also a concept of 30 in the Gemara. It's the same idea. So Rabbi Shimon continues, if there are 30, my son and I are 2 of them. If there are only 10 righteous people, my son and I are 2 of them. If 5, my son and I are 2 of them. If 2, they are my son and I. If there is but 1, it is me. In a different place, he says like this. Rabbi Shimon says, I have seen the sons of heaven, and they are very few. If there be 1,000, I and my son are among them. If 100, I and my son are among them. If only 2, they are I and my son. In a different place, he says, like this. Wait 1 second. He says, if there are 30 righteous, If there are not 30 righteous, then 20 should be enough. And if there are not 20, then 10 should be enough. And if not 10, then 2 should be enough. And if only 1, it is me. So here, these sound very egotistical. He is saying, I am the Tzaddik. He has no embarrassment about saying it. But later, there's another story that explains what he's getting at. And the story is that Rabbi Shimon sees, it's like in a vision, a dark cloud overtaking the entire world. And he says to his son, let's go and see what's happening here. And they see an angel who is bringing this darkness on the world. And he says, what are you doing here? And the angel says, I have come to destroy the world. The world doesn't deserve to exist. And Rabbi Shimon said, go back to God and tell him Bar Yochai is in the world. So the angel goes back, and when he comes back, he says, God said I should ignore you. Go ahead and destroy the world. In other words, we imagine like the time of the flood, where the world simply lost its reason to exist, its justification to exist. So Rabbi Shimon now says like this. He says, go back and tell God that I will not allow this. Tell him the Bar Yochai is in the world. And then the story is that a voice came out of heaven and said from God, fortunate is your portion, Rabbi Shimon, for God decrees above and you rescind below. Certainly about you the verse is written, the will of those who fear him is done. This is an idea that we already explored, that it says in the Gemara that a tzaddik decrees and God fulfills. And the obvious question is, isn't it the opposite? God is the one who decrees and the tzaddik is the one who fulfills. But the sages who are trying to tell us, of course, that's true, obviously. But it's also telling us that there are times that the tzaddik, because God wants people to take the responsibility. That's what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was doing when he said, I am the one, but I take responsibility for the world. And here you see that his judgment has turned into compassion. He has compassion for the world, even though he sees the world clearly. The world has been a mess for a long time. He wasn't blind to that, but his compassion, like Moshe's, overwhelmed that. According to the Arizal, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a reincarnation of Moshe. So now we'll go back to the other version of what did he mean? How long is the world going to stand on one foot? So what happens is he then takes his son and he puts him on his right hand, and he takes Rabbi Abba, who is the senior student, and he puts him on his left. And he says, now the world has a proper foundation. And we have to remember at this gathering, there are exactly 10 people. And so they represent the 10 sfirot. And here, Rabbi Shimon is putting the two together. It's the world can't stand on just one tzaddik anymore. There have to be more tzadikim. And he is telling his students, I need to empower you. And that's why I'm going to reveal these deep secrets, because I can't be the only one who knows this. We have to have more of a foundation. So that's the introduction to this part of the Zohar called the Idra Rabba. What is the rest of the Idra Rabba about? Now, obviously, I can only give it over in a few sentences. But here, the main idea is the need to draw compassion into the world. When it gets down to it, it's actually one of the most complicated parts of the Zohar. And it's very anthropomorphic to the extreme. But it's based on the idea that in the highest levels of God, it's pure compassion. But as creation descended from purely spiritual, all light, into a physical material world, as it goes to the four Kabbalistic worlds, the worlds become more physical and material. As they become more physical and material, the aspect of judgment becomes more pronounced. And that's why in the first account of creation, only the name Elohim, which is associated with judgment, appears. And so, in short, what Rabbi Shimon is giving over is a very, very complex idea of the structure of godliness throughout all of the different worlds. And he's trying to show his students that their main task is to draw God's compassion into the world through their actions, their attitude, their consciousness, because God wants us to be partners in creation. Remember, the very end of the story of creation are the words that God created to do. Asher bara Elokim la'asot. That God created to do. Everyone asks, the word to do is very redundant. Everything that God created. What does it mean to do? And so it's answered. What it means is God, in a certain way, left creation undone in order that human beings who are created in the image of God should become partners with God in the ongoing saga of creation. And so here, Rabbi Shimon, as the Tzadik, and we go back to Yosef also. Yosef made his transition from judgment to compassion. We see that in the beginning of creation, God, as it were, made a transition from having his creation be based only on judgment. And again, judgment is not a bad concept. It's not a negative concept, but it has its limitations. It limits tshuva, that a person can change. So here we see Yosef the Tzadik and his changes, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and his changes. and how the role of the tzaddik is the foundation of the world. That's how we're connecting the idea of creation with the role of the tzaddik as the partner. And as we said, ve'amech kulam tzadikim, and your people are all tzadikim. So I want to introduce just one more idea here, and that is we have a concept, especially in Chassidut, called hamtakat adinim, sweetening the judgments. It's a very, very important concept that this world is very full of judgment. And that's what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was trying to explain, how what's called the hishtalshalut, the evolution of the world from a purely spiritual light, like the light of the first day, until you get to the physical material world where judgments are pronounced. And again, the role of the tzaddik, the role of the Jewish people, is to bring compassion into the world. And so, what does this concept mean, to sweeten the judgments? And so, in short, what it really means is compassion. In other words, there's a situation. We go through this 24/7. Every day we're confronted with different situations in our life. Some of them are full of love and not complicated, but we all know our lives are very complicated. There's a lot of negativity in the world, a lot of judgment in the world, a lot of rectification that has to happen. And so how do you sweeten the judgments? Through compassion. And we have a verse, and everyone can look it up, in Isaiah 49:10. It's part of many, many different messianic prophecies of Isaiah. And there he says, Ki mirachamam yinahagem. The one, he's talking about the future Mashiach. And he says that the one who has compassion, he will lead, meaning he will be the ultimate leader. He will be Mashiach. And his major soul personality, his attribute, will be compassion. So this is a very, very important idea, because we see compassion from the beginning of creation, but to bring it to its fulfillment will be Mashiach, whose main attribute will be compassion. And that will fuel his ability to lead. So this is very relevant to each and every person. And we're told that we have a spark of Mashiach. And a teaching from Rav Ginsburg is that when enough people have activated and realized their own personal spark of Mashiach, it will create a critical mass of spiritual energy that will draw the Mashiach into the world. And so each and every person has a role to play. Each and every person has scores every week of opportunities to introduce compassion into what's happening in our lives. Obviously, there are times where judgment is the proper call in the moment, to being strong, to not allow oneself to be walked over, however we want to describe it. But here the idea is the idea of compassion. So this word mirachem, which means the one who has compassion, hamirachem. The gematria of mirachem is 288. Now we've learned this number before, that this number is, according to the Arizal, the number of shattered vessels and the light that they contain that fell into this world when the previous world was destroyed in what's called Shfirat HaKelim. Now again, this number is very symbolic. We don't mean exactly 288 vessels, but it's symbolic of the idea that this world consists of the broken vessels of the previous world. And therefore, this world is called the world of rectification, Olam HaTikun, because that is our reality. That's the existential reality of this world, it's in the need of rectification. And so here we see that the word for compassion, the one who has compassion, merachem, equals 288. That is how we sweeten the judgments. So I want to put in one more idea here. In last week's Torah portion, Vayechi, it is unique among all of the portions because it's called a closed portion. Parsha Stuma. What does that mean? Every parsha in the Torah, if we can imagine, it's like a new paragraph. The way that a Torah scroll is written, there'll be a space between the previous Torah portion and the next one, except for Vayechi. The previous portion ends, and without a break, the new one begins. So it's called a closed parsha. Rashi gives two explanations. Why is this different than any other portion? So he says, because in this portion, Yosef and Yaakov die, and what follows in this week's parsha of Shimon, the slavery begins. And so it says the eyes and the hearts of Israel were closed off because of the exile and the slavery coming. The other reason he gives is when Yaakov blesses all of his children, first he says, gather around and I will reveal to you what will happen in the end of days. And then he starts giving blessings to his children. So everyone asks, well, where is the prophecy of the end of days? And we're told that at that moment, the Shekhinah left him. It was closed off from him to be able, he saw, but God took away, God didn't want this prophecy to be revealed at that time. So what Yaakov did, though, is he hid much of Jewish history of what would occur in the blessings. And Rashi explains at great depth how many of what would happen to each tribe is in their blessings. So why am I bringing this up at this point? Is that according to Kabbalah and Chassidut, there's another reason why it's called a closed parsha. And that's because we're told that the next 4 books in the Torah all are about the slavery in Egypt and how we leave Egypt and then wander for 40 years until we come to the gates of the Holy Land. And we're told that on one level, this is all an allegory for each soul that comes into the world. And because the soul is pure, it is connected to God, but when it comes into a physical body, a material, physical, flawed world, it's like called a closed parsha. We all live existentially in a closed parsha. A soul within a body is a closed parsha. But what is the name of the parsha? Vayechi. And he lived. And it says that he lived, it's talking about Yaakov. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shva esrei shana. He lived in Egypt. Egypt, the word Mitzrayim means a narrow place. He lived in this narrow place for 17 years. 17 equals the gematria of the word for good, tov. So we're told that what is Yaakov establishing? That even in exile, even in a state of slavery, even in a narrow place like Mitzrayim, you can live. And so and also Yosef. Yosef went down to Egypt by himself. Yaakov at least went down with all of his family. Yosef was in Egypt all by himself and ended up in jail for 12 years. He was a slave, and he was able to maintain his Jewishness. So he and Yaakov paved the way for all of us to be able to live despite the fact that we live in a closed parsha, an existential closed parsha. And so this is very, very connected to Ma'aseh Bereishit, because this whole class was about the role of the Tzadik, the role of the righteous person. And we see that every person has that potential. Every person has that spark of being righteous, and that our souls exist from the beginning of creation until Mashiach comes. And we saw how rachamim, how compassion is one of the themes running through all of creation, and especially of how to fix creation. What God wants from us is our partnership. And because when we deal with rectification, that is when we're reaching what's called being in the image of God. So one other prophecy from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah, is that Malah ha'oretz Deya et Hashem kamayim liyam mechasim, that the knowledge of God will fill the earth like the waters cover the sea. This is, of course, a messianic vision that this idea of living in a world of judgment, of a world of existential obstacles and even trauma, will not last forever. That when the Mashiach comes, remember, it's God who is sending the Mashiach. So the Mashiach is a messenger who will pave the way for God revealing his light and love and presence in a way that we really can't even imagine right now. And we're told that the knowledge of God will cover the world like the waters cover the sea. It will be a different type of consciousness altogether. And we can touch it in different moments of meditation, moments of prayer, moments of study, moments of doing acts of kindness. We can touch this idea of the expansiveness that is going to engulf all of the world and human consciousness. May we all live to experience it.